Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today is going to be a heavy one, but an incredibly necessary one. We are looking at a system that has been running in the background and often the foreground of the American experiment for 400 years.
And we are doing that through the lens of Norman Coombs' seminal work, The Black Experience in America. Now, before we even get into the weeds here, I want to set the stage for you. Usually when we learn about history, especially American history, it's taught as a series of events. You have the colonial era, then the Revolution, then the Civil War, then civil rights, like chapters in a book.
Right. And the assumption in that traditional narrative is that things naturally get better, that the timeline is a straight line sloping upward toward justice.
Exactly. Progress is just inevitable.
It creates this feeling that it just happens on its own, just because time is passing.
It's the arc of the moral universe idea. But what we are looking at today, and what Coombs argues so effectively, is that this isn't just a history of events, it is a history of structural continuity. We are looking at a system, a machine, really.
That's the key word, system. If you treat racism or exclusion as just a series of bad attitudes or individual prejudices, you miss the mechanics of it.
You miss the blueprint.
You do. The core argument we're tackling today is that American democracy and racial exclusion were not opposing forces that just happened to collide by accident. They developed simultaneously. They were, in a very uncomfortable way, codependent.
That is a massive claim. We like to think of democracy as the hero and slavery as the villain, and eventually the hero wins, but you're saying they grew up in the same crib.
They did. And the mission for this deep dive is to trace how that system of racial hierarchy was engineered, literally designed, how it was institutionalized, and here's the scary part, how whenever it was threatened, it was redesigned.
Redesigned to do what?
To maintain the same outcomes under different names.
It's like a virus that mutates to survive a vaccine.
That is a very apt analogy. And this brings us right to the crisis in perception. If we isolate slavery, segregation, and the civil rights movement as separate, disconnected chapters, we are blinded to the interconnected incentive structures that link them all.
We see the symptoms, but we miss the disease.
Exactly. We think because the name of the law changed, the system changed. And Coombs is here to tell us that is not the case.
Okay, let's unpack this. If we're going to look at this as a system design, we have to start at the beginning, the design phase, if you will. And Coombs starts us off by shattering a pretty common myth, which is the blank slate narrative.
Right. The blank slate or the savage narrative, it's a crucial first step for this system.
Why? Why is that narrative so important?
Well, to justify the system of extraction that became the slave trade, there had to be a perception that the people being extracted had no culture, no civilization, no history. It's much easier to treat a human being as a raw material if you convince yourself they are, culturally speaking, empty vessels.
It's a form of cognitive dissonance management, right? If I'm a civilized European Christian, I can't, in good conscience, enslave another civilized person, so I have to reclassify them.
You have to downgrade their humanity to upgrade your profit margin. It's a brutal calculation, but the reality, as Coombs points out, was wildly different. We aren't talking about unorganized tribes wandering the wilderness. We're talking about massive empires.
Let's get specific here, because I think the savage myth really hides in the generalities. What are we actually looking at in West Africa pre-1600s?
Okay, we're looking at West Africa. We're talking about Ghana, Mali, Songhai. These were complex, stratified civilizations. Coombs gives this great detail about the king of Ghana around the 11th century. This wasn't a tribal chieftain in a hut. This was a monarch who could field an army of 200,000 warriors.
200,000? That is a staggering number for the medieval period. That rivals or even exceeds European armies at the same time.
It absolutely does. And listen to this, 40,000 of them were archers. But here's the detail that really sticks out to me. The text mentions their power wasn't just in numbers, it was technology. They had iron-tipped spears.
So they had an industrial base, they had metallurgy.
They did. They were operating in the Iron Age while some of their neighbors were still using copper or bone. So there's a technological hierarchy there already.
And it wasn't just military might, right? It was more than that.
Oh, absolutely. There was an intellectual infrastructure. You had Timbuktu, which was a legendary university city, a center for scholarship. You had complex legal systems. You had distinct social hierarchies that predated European arrival by centuries.
So the tragedy, the crisis in perception here, is that when Europeans arrived, they mistook a technological gap for a biological or cultural gap.
Exactly. because Europe had one key piece of tech. Europe had gunpowder and was beginning the Industrial Revolution. Africa had iron, but they didn't have guns yet. That technological disparity allowed Europe to dominate, but the Europeans perceived that dominance as proof of innate superiority.
So they looked at a complex civilization and just saw savagery because it didn't look like their civilization.
It's like if an alien landed today with a ray gun and decided that because we only have nuclear weapons, we must be animals.
That's effectively what happened. The Europeans had a specific military advantage, and they extrapolated that into a total moral and biological superiority. And that misperception became the ideological foundation of the system.
And that system needed an engine.
So on top of this misconception, you have the startup of the trade itself. And this is where the system analysis gets really cold and really fascinating. Coombs argues that the transatlantic slave trade wasn't driven by racial hatred initially. It was driven by an algorithm, a capitalist loop.
It was pure incentive structure. We call it the triangular trade, but think of it as a self-reinforcing economic loop. Europe has manufactured goods, textiles, tools, guns. Africa has human resources. The New World has raw materials.
And the loop just feeds itself.
Exactly. The more slaves you bring to the New World, the more raw materials, sugar, cotton, tobacco you can produce. The more materials you produce, the more wealth flows to Europe. The more wealth in Europe, the more they can manufacture goods and build ships to go get more slaves. It's an engine that, once started, runs on its own logic.
But here is the trap. This is the system design part that is so insidious. The Europeans didn't just show up and conquer Africa. They couldn't have. Not initially.
No, not at all. The malaria, the organized armies, that would have stopped them cold, so they had to trade. But they introduced a specific commodity that broke the local system.
Guns.
Guns. This is the transatlantic algorithm at its most vicious. Imagine you are a West African king. You have neighbors who are rivals. Suddenly, those neighbors start trading captives to Europeans for muskets.
Okay, so now my neighbor is armed, and I'm not.
Exactly. Your neighbors have guns and you have spears. You have a survival imperative. You must get guns to defend your people. But the only currency the Europeans will accept for guns is
Captives.
captives. So even if you find the trade morally repugnant, the incentive structure forces you to participate. You have to raid others to get captives, to buy guns, to protect yourself from being raided.
It's a feedback loop of violence that just spirals.
It depopulated vast regions of the continent. It wasn't just selling your own people out of greed, though that certainly existed. It was often selling others to survive in a game that was rigged from the outside.
That reframes it completely. It's not just bad people doing bad things. It's people trapped in a game theory nightmare.
Precisely. It's a prisoner's dilemma, where the defecting strategy selling slaves is the only way to ensure survival. And once those captives are in the system, the dehumanization process begins. And Coombs uses a specific term here, shock procurement.
Shock procurement. It sounds like a military term. Or something from industrial manufacturing.
It is, in a way. It's a concept from Stanley Elkins, whose theories Coombs discusses. The idea is that you don't just enslave a person physically. You have to break their psychological connection to their past self.
You have to erase who they were before.
Yes. The Middle Passage wasn't just transportation. It was a trauma designed to strip identity. You're chained, you're sick, you're surrounded by death and people who don't speak your language. It's meant to induce shock.
And then you have seasoning in the Caribbean.
Right, the Caribbean interlude. I think a lot of Americans think slaves came straight from Africa to Virginia, but usually they stopped in Barbados or Jamaica first.
And what happened there? What was seasoning?
It was the breaking in period. A brutal, high mortality environment where the African was stripped of their name, their language, and their social status and turned into a unit of labor. It's where they learned to fear the whip and respond to orders.
So by the time they reached the American South, the system had already worked to erase the African and create the Negro, a labor category defined by race.
It's reprogramming. You take a person who was a father, a warrior, maybe a craftsman in Mali, and you run them through this grinder until they are just a hand?
A hand. That's the term they used, isn't it?
Exactly. Field hands, not people. Parts of a machine.
And that leads us into the American system specifically, because Coombs makes a really interesting comparison here. He compares slavery in the U.S. to slavery in Latin America, like Brazil. And I think for a lot of listeners, this is going to be surprising. We tend to think slavery is slavery. Bad is bad.
And it is all bad, certainly. No one is arguing that Latin American slavery was good, But the systems were different, and those differences had massive long-term effects.
So what was the variable? What made the U.S. system unique?
In the U.S., the system was unchecked: capitalism and individualism.
Which sounds like a good thing in any other context.
Hmm?
We pride ourselves on capitalism and individualism.
Paradoxically, yes. But in the context of slavery, it was disastrous for the enslaved. In the U.S., the slave was capital, a piece of property, a line item on a ledger, just part of the production machine. And because white individualism was so highly valued, this idea of every man being a king in his own castle, the denial of the slave's individualism had to be absolute. There could be no middle ground. You were either free and white or slave and black. The color line was rigid.
Okay, so total opposition.
Yes.
And in Latin America?
In Latin America, you had two other massive institutions that checked the power of the plantation owner: the crown and the church.
The Catholic Church.
Right. The church was interested in the slave's soul. The crown was interested in the slave as a subject. So legally and spiritually, the slave was recognized as a human being who happened to be in a bad legal situation.
So practically, what did that look like? Did it actually change their daily lives, or is this just theological hair splitting?
Oh, it had huge real-world consequences. It meant marriage was a sacrament, recognized by the church. So breaking up families, while it still happened, was seen as a sin. The law provided some protections, at least on paper, and manumission, buying your freedom, was socially encouraged. It was seen as a pious act to free your slaves, or to let them buy their way out. There were more pathways to freedom.
Whereas in the U.S., freeing a slave was often legally difficult or socially discouraged.
Exactly, because it blurred that rigid color line. It threatened the entire capital structure. If property can become a person, the whole system gets shaky.
So what here is that in the U.S. system, the slave was the thing. In the Latin system, the slave was a person in servitude.
Exactly. And that shaped the psychological landscape for centuries. It's why you see different racial dynamics in Brazil today versus the U.S. Not that racism doesn't exist there, but the binary, rigid, one-drop rule is a uniquely American invention designed to protect the capital investment of the U.S. slaveholder.
The American system required the total negation of the black person's humanity to function.
It did. And this is where it gets really dark. Let's talk about the psychological impact on the enslaved people in the U.S. Coombs brings up the Sambo construct. This is a stereotype we've seen in old movies and literature: the happy, childlike, dependent slave.
It's just like a minefield to discuss.
It is a very controversial and painful topic, but Coombs navigates it by looking at Elkin's theory again. The theory compares U.S. slavery to a concentration camp.
That is a heavy comparison.
It is, and the argument is, can a system be so total, so controlling, that it actually infantilizes the people trapped in it?
What do you mean by a closed system?
A closed system is one where the authority figure controls absolutely every aspect of life: food, sleep, punishment, reward. If the only way to survive is to please the master, Elkins asks, do you eventually adopt the personality the master wants to see? Do you become dependent?
It's a chilling thought that you could engineer a personality type through trauma and control. That the Sambo wasn't just a racist caricature, but a product of psychological warfare.
It is. But, and this is a huge but, Coombs immediately points out the glitches in that system. If the system was perfect, if it was as total as a concentration camp, everyone would have been a Sambo, everyone would have been broken.
But they weren't.
But they weren't. You had resistance.
Right. We usually think of resistance as the big revolts, Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey. But Coombs talks about passive resistance.
Exactly. This is where we have to read between the lines of the historical record. The slave owner's diary is full of complaints about the lazy slave, the slave who stole from the master.
And the owner looked at that and said, see, they are naturally lazy and dishonest.
Right. It confirmed their bias. But from the structural perspective, that was sabotage.
The labor strike, a slowdown.
It is economic warfare. If I can't be free, I will make my labor as inefficient as possible. I will break the tools. I will accidentally let the mules wander off. I'll feign illness. It was a battle of wills fought every single day.
And then there's cultural retention.
Which is another huge system glitch. The survival of Africanisms in music, in folklore, in religion. The system tried to strip identity, but it failed. The human spirit was resilient enough to hack the system. You get the birth of the spiritual songs that are both about religious salvation and coded messages about escape.
So the system wasn't total. But let's talk about the revolts you mentioned, specifically how the system reacted to them. You mentioned Nat Turner.
Yes, Nat Turner led a violent rebellion in Virginia in 1831. Now, look at how the system classified him. They didn't call him a rebel or a freedom fighter or a general.
What do they call him?
They called him a madman, a fanatic, a religious zealot who went insane.
Why does the label matter?
Because if Nat Turner is a rational man fighting for freedom, then the system of slavery is immoral. It admits that a sane person would want to kill to escape it. That's a terrifying admission for the slaveholding class.
What if he's crazy?
But if Nat Turner is crazy, if he's a psychopath, then the system is still good, and he is just a broken unit. The system protects its own narrative by pathologizing resistance. It individualizes the problem to avoid indicting the structure.
That's a powerful insight. The system protects its own narrative. We see that echo all the way to the present day.
We do. But let's stick to the timeline for a moment. We have this machine running for centuries. It's extracting labor, it's enforcing a racial hierarchy, it's generating massive wealth for the North and South. We can't forget the North's role in finance, insurance, shipping.
It's an American system, not just a Southern one.
Absolutely. But then the machine breaks. The Civil War.
The glitch. The ultimate system error.
So the glitch. And this leads us to part 3, the redesign. Because the standard history book says, Emancipation Proclamation, war ends, slaves are free, the end.
And that is the crisis in perception in a nutshell.
Exactly. Because the system didn't die, it just lost its legal designation of ownership. The incentives remained. The South still needed a cheap, controllable labor force to harvest cotton. The North still needed cheap cotton for its textile mills, and the white population, North and South, still desired a racial hierarchy.
So emancipation ended ownership, but it didn't end the need for the function that slavery provided.
Precisely. So we enter the patch phase, Reconstruction. And for a moment, it looks like real change is possible. This is a brief window where the federal government actually tried to change the system.
You had the Freedmen's Bureau.
The Freedmen's Bureau setting up schools, providing aid. You had black voting protected by federal troops. You had black elected officials, Senators Hiram Revels, Blanche K. Bruce from Mississippi, of all places.
It sounds like for a minute the system actually rebooted into a multiracial democracy.
It tried. But the immune system of the old order attacked it violently. You have the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, not just as a hate group, but as an enforcement arm. A paramilitary force designed to terrorize the labor force and its political allies back into submission.
They weren't just burning crosses, they were assassinating political organizers.
Exactly. They were the system's muscle when the law briefly failed to oppress. And then the political will in the North just faded.
And then the Great Betrayal. 1877.
The Hayes-Tilden Compromise. This is a pivotal moment in American structural history. Essentially, you have a disputed presidential election. It's a mess.
Okay.
And the Northern industrialists and politicians, they're tired of the Negro problem. They want stability. They want to get back to business. So to settle the election, the Republicans get the presidency.
In exchange for what?
In exchange for pulling all federal troops out of the South.
They traded black rights for Southern stability.
They traded black rights for capital flow. Northern capital and Southern aristocracy found common ground. The black population was the cost of doing business. And once the federal protection left, the redesign began in earnest. We call it Jim Crow.
Coombs describes this not just as segregation, but as economic bondage. I want to dig into the mechanics of this because I think people miss the economic side. We think of Jim Crow as separate water fountains.
The water fountains were the symbol, the economics were the reality. Look at sharecropping. It sounds benign. I shared the crop with you, but structurally, it was a trap.
How so? Walk me through it.
Okay. You're a newly freed black man. You have nothing, no land, no tools, no money. I own a plantation. I say, you can work a piece of my land.
Sounds like an opportunity.
Right. But you need tools. You need seed. You need food to live on until the harvest. I provide all of that on credit. I lend you the tools and seed. You work all year. At the end of the harvest, I do the math. I control the ledger. I set the price for your cotton and for my supplies. And surprise, the cost of the seed and tools is higher than the value of your share of the crop.
So you owe me money.
You owe me money. And legally, you cannot leave my land until you pay your debt. That is debt peonage.
So you're trapped.
It effectively recreated the outcomes of slavery, forced labor, no mobility, without the capital investment of buying humans.
It's almost more efficient for the landowner. You don't have to feed them when they get old.
It's brutally efficient. If a slave died, you lost $1,000. If a sharecropper died, you just found another one. And then you have the convict lease system. This is the darkest part of the redesign.
How did that work?
The southern states passed a bunch of new laws. Vagrancy laws. If a black man is unemployed, arrest him. Loitering, arrest him. Speaking too loudly, arrest him.
So they criminalize poverty and blackness itself.
Yes. And then the state would lease these convicts out to a mine or a plantation or a railroad. It was slavery by another name run by the state. And the mortality rates in these camps were often higher than under slavery because the renter had no long-term financial incentive to keep the property alive.
My God, and the Supreme Court stamped this with approval.
Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896. The highest court in the land looked at this entire redesigned system and said, this is fine. The doctrine of separate but equal. They formally institutionalized the patch. The system was now secure again. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments had been effectively neutralized by state laws and economic coercion.
So facing this redesigned, airtight system of oppression, what do you do? This brings us to part 4, leadership strategies. And I love how Coombs breaks this down. It's not just black leaders. It's a debate about strategy. How do you hack a system that is rigged against you?
Right. We often pit these men against each other personally, but they were really proposing different systemic responses based on their analysis of the problem. Let's start with Booker T. Washington.
The accommodationist. That's usually a dirty word in modern context.
That's the label. But look at his logic. He's operating in the Deep South. Lynchings are common. Political resistance is being met with immediate, overwhelming violence. So Washington says, okay, we can't win the political war right now. The system will crush us.
So what's his move?
He says, let's make ourselves economically indispensable.
This is the cast down your bucket where you are speech.
Exactly, the Atlanta Compromise speech. He's saying to the white South, we will stop agitating for social equality and voting rights for now. In exchange, you let us work. You hire us instead of immigrants. You let us build our own businesses, learn trades.
He was trying to trade social equality for economic opportunity.
He was trying to buy safety with labor. He believed, if I have money, if I'm useful, I will eventually get respect and rights. The flaw, of course, was that the system didn't reciprocate.
How so?
It took the accommodation, the political submission, but it didn't give the opportunity. Immigrants still got the industrial jobs in the North, and in the South, black wealth was often seen as a threat and destroyed if it grew too large. Just look at the history of Tulsa or Rosewood. The system punished black success.
Which brings us to W.E.B. Du Bois, the confrontationist.
Du Bois looks at Washington's plan and says, you are creating a permanent caste of second-class citizens. His logic was that you cannot earn rights that are legally yours. You have to demand them.
So his strategy is the opposite.
Completely. He argued that if you give up political power, you will never have the power to defend your economic gains. The system will just take them from you, legally or illegally.
And he focused on the talented 10th. What was that?
That was his idea that an elite vanguard of the most educated black people, maybe 10%, would lead the race. They would challenge the legal and intellectual framework of the system.
So he's fighting on the legal and ideological battlefield.
Yes. He co-founded the NAACP. He focused on the courts, the laws, the mine. He believed if you could prove black humanity intellectually and legally, the system would have to fold. He was attacking the narrative part of the system, the idea of inferiority.
But then you have Marcus Garvey, and he's doing something completely different. He's not talking to white people at all, really.
Garvey is fascinating because he diagnosed a psychological wound that Washington and Du Bois, in their own ways, missed. He realized the system had attacked black dignity, so his strategy was separatism.
Back to Africa.
That was the slogan. But the logic was deeper. It was, this system is unfixable for us. We will never be respected here. We will never be seen as fully human. The only solution is to exit the system entirely.
So he promotes black pride, black capitalism.
A black nation. He was tapping into that need for identity that we talked about earlier, the identity that was systematically stripped during the slave trade. He validated the black identity that the system tried to erase.
So even though his shipping line failed and he was eventually deported, he made a huge impact.
A massive psychological impact. He changed the psychology of the masses. He proved you could mobilize people around pride. He showed that you didn't need white approval to have worth.
And speaking of mobilization, that brings us to A. Philip Randolph.
The mobilization strategy. Randolph is the bridge to the modern era. He looked at the system and said, this system respects one thing above all else: power. Not just law, not just money, but collective power.
He organized the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters.
A labor union. But he used it for civil rights. He understood that economic power was leverage. And in 1941, he threatened a massive march on Washington to protest discrimination in defense jobs.
1941. We usually think of the March on Washington as 1963 with Martin Luther King.
That's the point. Randolph invented the blueprint over 20 years earlier. He told FDR, "I'm bringing 100,000 black people to the White House lawn while you're trying to fight a war for democracy abroad."
And what happened?
FDR panicked. He couldn't afford that kind of protest during the war, so he signed an executive order banning discrimination in defense industries. Randolph didn't even have to march. The threat was enough.
Wow.
He proved that mass physical presence combined with economic pressure could force the system's hand. He realized that the system responds to leverage, not just moral appeals.
So we have these competing strategies. But while the leaders are debating, the people are moving. And we get to part 5, feedback loops, the Great Migration.
This is one of the biggest demographic shifts in American history. Millions of black people moving from the rural South to the urban North.
Looking for the promised land.
But here's the crisis in perception again. They thought racism was a regional problem, a Southern problem. They thought if they crossed the Mason-Dixon line, the system would be different.
But it wasn't.
It was just designed differently. In the South, you had Jim Crow segregation. By law, you had signs on the water fountains. In the North, you had de facto segregation by fact.
So no signs, but the same outcome.
Right. You had restrictive housing covenants where homeowners associations agreed not to sell to black families. You had white flight to the suburbs. You had job discrimination. The system just adapted.
It created the ghetto.
The ghetto was the northern structural response to the migration. You contain the population, you limit their economic mobility, you police the borders heavily. It was a new version of the plantation, just urban and without the direct oversight of a single master.
Can we talk about redlining for a second? Because that term gets thrown around a lot, but what is it actually?
It was literally government policy. The Federal Housing Administration created maps to decide where to insure mortgages after the Depression.
Okay.
And on these maps, they drew red lines around black and integrated neighborhoods and said, high risk, do not lend here. If you lived there, you couldn't get a government-backed loan to buy a home or even fix your roof.
So while white Americans were building massive amounts of wealth through home ownership in the suburbs, subsidized by the government, black Americans were locked out of that primary engine of capital accumulation.
Exactly. It was an invisible wall. You didn't need a whites-only sign if the bank just wouldn't give them a loan. And this leads us right into the modern era. The civil rights movement, we have the victories, Brown v. Board in 54, the Civil Rights Act in 64, the Voting Rights Act in 65. The legal framework of exclusion was dismantled.
And this is where the conversation gets difficult but necessary. Because if the legal framework was dismantled, why did the riots happen? Why Watts in 65? Why Detroit and Newark in 67?
That was the white perception in the 60s, right? We gave you everything you asked for. We passed the laws. Why are you burning down the neighborhood?
It seemed ungrateful to the white observer.
Exactly. That is the crisis. The white perception was the system has been fixed. The laws are changed. The black perception was the structure hasn't changed. The police are still brutalizing us. The housing is still segregated and terrible. The jobs aren't there.
So changing the law on paper didn't change the incentives or the economics on the ground.
Precisely. The system's outcomes persisted. And that's why the movement shifted from Martin Luther King's moral appeal to black power.
With figures like Stokely Carmichael.
Yes. The logic shifted. The argument became, appeals to America's conscience have failed because the system is designed for power, not morality. You can't integrate into a burning house.
What does that mean, integrate into a burning house?
It means, why are we fighting so hard to get into a system that is fundamentally corrupt and racist? The goal shouldn't be integration. It should be community control, self-determination. It was a synthesis of Du Bois' intellect, Garvey's pride, and Randolph's mobilization.
Integration is a subterfuge for the maintenance of white supremacy. That was Carmichael's argument, right?
Yes. His point was, if success means moving into a white neighborhood, sending your kids to a white school, and working for a white boss, you are implicitly accepting that white equals good and black equals bad. You are draining the black community of its talent and resources.
So he wanted political modernization, for the black community to control its own police, its own schools, its own economy.
Exactly. It was a call to stop asking for entry into the system and start building their own.
So, bringing this all the way to the present day, or at least the end of Coombs's analysis, we are looking at structural continuity.
That is the thread that runs through everything. Slavery, black codes, Jim Crow, just urban ghettoization. The recurring pattern is that when the moral consensus shifts and one tool of oppression is taken away, The institution redesigns itself to preserve the core hierarchy using new tools.
And the economic legacy is the wealth gap.
It's not an accident. It's the direct, predictable result of centuries of labor extraction, followed by exclusion from capital accumulation. You can't extract wealth for 250 years, then block access to banking and housing for another 100 years, and then say, okay, race is over, everyone is equal now, the math doesn't work.
It's like playing a game of Monopoly, but one player had to play for 3 hours with no money and no ability to buy property, and then suddenly you say, okay, now the rules are fair for everyone.
And the other players own all the hotels on Boardwalk and Park Place.
Exactly. The game is still rigged by the previous turns. So what does this all mean for us, for you, the listener, trying to make sense of the world today?
It means we have to stop looking for bad apples and start looking at the orchard design. Isolating the civil rights movement as a success story that finished the job fragments our understanding. The Black experience, as Coombs lays it out, reveals that American democracy functions as an interconnected system where power, identity, and economics co-evolve.
And you can't fix one without addressing the others.
You can't. You have to look at the incentives.
Right.
The crisis in perception is the belief that surface reforms, changing the laws, changing the names of things, equals structural transformation. But the system endures because it aligns material incentives with cultural narratives.
That is a lot to digest, but it's a powerful framework. Instead of just seeing a series of unfortunate events in history, we see the blueprint.
And hopefully, if we can see the blueprint, we can figure out how to actually redesign the structure rather than just painting over the cracks again.
And that really is the final provocative thought, isn't it? The question remains, do we have the courage to redesign the incentives, or will we just rename the system again?
That's the question for the next generation.
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.